Hey everyone, this is Chris Hickson, and my presentation, as you can see, is on deaf children in a mainstream classroom. And I want to take a look at the best practices that teachers today are implementing in their classrooms when working with deaf and hard of hearing students. In order to do that, I think first I need to go over a brief history of how we educated deaf students, specifically in America, and kind of how, in a lot of ways, it mirrored the progress of education for non-deaf students as well. And even though that was a lot slower for deaf students, that it still was very similar. So in the 1800s, the deaf and hard of hearing students were educated at home. Um, this was often by either parents that learned sign language, or typically typically parents would hire teachers or educators, I guess, of the time that knew sign language to come and work with their students. In a few occasions, for very wealthy families that had deaf children, they could send them to Europe to be educated. At this point in time, America really didn't have a lot of formal education programs for deaf children, and Europe was certainly ahead of us at this point. In 1817, the American School for the Deaf was founded, and this was sort of the first step that we took to educate the deaf and hard of hearing population. Originally, the oral method was used here, and this was something that was brought over from Europe, and it again mirrored a lot of what we read about in Dr. Pang's book, and specifically in chapter 1 and chapter 2, about how the idea of education was to assimilate the students to the goals of the community or the nation, and less thought was really placed on the students' wants and desires, and what was best for them, and more thought was placed on how they might best benefit the community they're in, or how we might prepare them to take on the designated role that we thought they may fulfill. And that was sort of the same thing that was happening with deaf children. The oral method was just a way to force deaf children to mold to what we wanted them to be. We wanted the deaf children to be able to communicate with us, as opposed to molding the curriculum um, to benefit them, to teach them and allow them to have the options to pursue the American dream. Um, but as time went on, manualism started to spread, and that's sort of an older term for sign languages, because there are different versions. And today, the most popular one is American Sign Language, but at the time there were a few different ones that were widespread. And so schools began to pop up all over the country that were specifically designed to educate deaf children. And deaf children still, at this point, for the most part, were not being educated with the main populace. They weren't being mainstreamed. So their choices for education were still very limited, but this was certainly a step in the right direction. Um, the use of sign language really gave a lot of deaf people a sense of pride, and allowed them to sort of start to build their community from within the schools they went to, and through that they really formed a strong sense of culture. They shared a sign language that was their own, and it was a language that they learned at a much more rapid rate than they did English for the most part, and this allowed them to develop the language and do the same kind of things that kids learning English or learning Spanish or learning any other language get to do. They play with the language, they get to interact with their peers with it, and create new words or slang, and really allowed them to sort of express themselves. Also, at the same time, Gallaudet University was established. This was the first university for deaf students, and our first federally funded university for deaf students, I should say. I believe their first federal funding budget, or however you want to call it, I believe was $300,000. That's just something that popped into my head right now, but it's an interesting fact. Um, so from then until about 1975, a lot of different ideas were thrown out about how to educate deaf children. Um, there was the idea that at first we had an oral focus, and then we went into manualism using sign language, and somewhere in between that went away, and once again we went back to the idea of trying to conform students to our idea of being an American or being what's best for our nation. And that started to sort of dissipate again with the introduction of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and that was in 1975. And this really started the ball rolling in terms of allowing deaf children and their parents to have options, because again at this time deaf schools were very popular, and they were set up all across the country, um, but in rural areas and even in some cities, those schools weren't available, and students had to be sent to schools to be educated there, and a lot of times they wouldn't get to see their family as much. Um, and so for some students, this really just wasn't a good environment to be in. And then with the introduction of not only EHCA, but then in 1990 when it was sort of changed to the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that really allowed students to begin attending mainstream schools, and it wasn't for all students. Again, a majority of deaf and hard of hearing students still continue to go to residential schools, schools for the deaf and hard of hearing. But this gave parents the option to decide where their children were going, because before, if they were to go to a mainstream school without a significant amount of residual hearing, most accommodations would not be provided, and specifically interpreters. At that time, most interpreters were family friends or children of deaf adults, or maybe a sibling, and so standards for interpreters were really not set. But with the introduction of IDEA, that changed. It all changed, and it allowed students to attend these schools and have the services needed to attend them. This act in particular ensured that students with disabilities had a fair chance at receiving a similar education that the other students were receiving. So now that sort of is where we were, and kind of has led into where we are now. And technology has changed a lot in terms of how we work with deaf students, and I really think it will continue to improve. And some of the technology that's used today, I think, is fascinating and far different than anything that was used even 10, 15 years ago. So again, one of the main ones is American Sign Language users, so deaf and hard of hearing students, can be provided with interpreters free of charge in the classroom by schools that receive federal funding. What's really kind of interesting about this, and kind of is something to think about, is in terms of English language learners, or students whose primary language is not English. We, at least in the district I'm in, and my understanding is pretty much all public institutions or educational institutions, interpreters are not provided for other languages such as Spanish or French or German. And so American Sign Language is the only one that I'm aware of that is provided all the time for the students. And I think it's interesting, and obviously, I think it would be difficult, near impossible for some completely deaf students to get by in a classroom without an interpreter. But I just think it's something interesting to think about, that we've sort of steered away from bilingual education, but it proves to be such a huge benefit for deaf students. But again, there are lots of different modifications that we can use in our classrooms that, in some cases, enhance the education for all the students, and not only the deaf and hard of hearing students. And that's what I think is really cool, is that from what I've read and from what I've seen, a lot of these things are great for deaf students, but certainly help the hearing students as well. And I'll go ahead and give you examples of some of these. So for ASL interpreters, interpreters support a variety of sign, and what I mean by that is there are deaf students and there are hard of hearing students, and even putting them in two different groups is hard to do because their language use and their understanding of sign language really varies from student to student. Some students might English might be their first language, and they use sign language as more of a support system. If they miss something, they'll look at the interpreter or things like that. Um, Whereas a student might be completely dependent on the interpreter and have no residual hearing, and English is very much a second language and not a very well understood one. So, in that sense, uh, sign language interpreters would be using more American Sign Language as opposed to sign supported English. Excuse me. Um, and I think that communication about the interpreter's role to your hearing population in your classroom is incredibly key. In some of the research that I read that's listed in my bibliography, one of the most common issues with interpreters is that hearing students have a hard time approaching them, and rightfully so. I think interpreters are very strange to people who have not been around them. So I can think of myself growing up. I didn't encounter an interpreter until high school, and it only was because I went to a small school with a high concentration of deaf and hard of hearing students that I even knew what an interpreter was or did. And even then, I think the rules were still sort of vague to me. Interpreters have to maintain a level of trust, um, and so a good example of this is discipline. So in a classroom, typically students look to adults as sort of the guides, especially for discipline. Students know that if they do something wrong and the teacher catches them, they're going to be in trouble. So, or if they say a bad word or something like that. But we all know that students, will use that language around their peers. Now, interpreters have sort of a unique role in that it's important that we don't allow them to take over the discipline in our classroom because they need to maintain their role as an interpreter. And what I mean by this is it's important that we include the deaf child in our classroom. And I mean, I think everybody agrees with that, or deaf children. But what's harder to do is to encourage the rest of the students to interact with the deaf student on their own without guidance, without basically being told to do it. And that can be really intimidating, especially when in order for them to do that, they have to go through an interpreter. They have to use an interpreter. They have to speak to an adult in order to speak to what could possibly be a friend. And so if they see the interpreter as another adult, like the teacher, a disciplinarian, the conversations they might be just inherently restricted or censored, and it's nothing that the interpreter is doing wrong in terms of interpretation. But if the students don't have a clear understanding that, hey, this adult isn't here to bust me if I use a swear word, or isn't here to tell me to get back on task if I'm talking about the latest Avengers movie or whatever, if they don't have a good understanding of that, they're less likely to interact with the deaf student, and that really is a detriment, I think, to a lot of our students, and is the reason why a lot of students feel very secluded in what's supposed to be their least restrictive environment. And so I think as teachers, it's important that we either provide the information to our students or allow the interpreter to provide the information to our students and explain what their role is. That way students feel more comfortable going up to them and communicating with the deaf student. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there and lost my place. Also, when we're designing lectures, lesson plans, activities, games, it's important to remember that we're working with an interpreter or we're working with deaf students, and there's several ways that this comes up, but some of the ones that immediately come to mind that seem very popular again in the research, in the two papers specifically that I read about deaf students in mainstream classrooms. One was about games and about how games need to be set up to include all students. And in my observations, one of the coolest ways I saw this implemented was during a Jeopardy game. When you think of Jeopardy, you think of the buzzer, and the idea is to be the first one to answer. And in a math class, that's not always the best thing to do because or any classroom for that matter, because the idea of a review Jeopardy game is to make sure that all of the students get it. And if you've got the fastest student or your highest performing student buzzing in every time with the answer, it's not giving the other children a chance to think or to have input. Um, and so what I saw this teacher do, which I think is a fantastic idea, is they had the Jeopardy game and they were set up into teams or table groups, and each table group would take a turn picking a question. Um, and once they picked the question would be read out loud, so that way the interpreter could also interpret it. Because the intent wasn't for let's take a word problem for example, um, or even just a simple math sentence. The intent of this particular activity was for them to prove concrete understanding of the math, and so for deaf and hard of hearing students, or any of our ELLs, English language learners, sorry, um, the the point to that is not to test their ability to decipher the English, but to test their concrete math skill. And so the time was given for the interpreter to interpret the question. And then instead of having the first student buzzer in and answer immediately, the teacher gave them in a lot of amount of time. I think it depended on the difficulty of the question, but I think it was 2 to 3 minutes or so for most questions. And the students had to come up with an individual answer, and then they had an additional minute to share their answer with the table group and decide on an answer. And I thought it was great because a lot of times what happens in classrooms with interpreters is when questions are asked on the fly, or you ask a classroom to give you an answer or raise their hands, a lot of times you'll have said the question, you'll have called on a student before the interpreter is even done interpreting the question. And that's not fair to the deaf students, and it doesn't allow them the opportunity to participate in a class that they may or may not enjoy. So now this is the same for lectures and or any other activities. It's important to remember that when working with an interpreter, you have to think about the time gap that is there from your message to them relaying the message. And another example that comes up a lot in classrooms is when you're going over answers. So again, in a math class, let's say they're working on multiplication tables, and they had a paper, a time quiz or whatever, and they had to answer as many as they could. And so now that they're done, you're going to go over it together as a class. And oftentimes what happens is the teacher will go, okay, the answer to number 1 is 4, the answer to number 2 is 16, the answer to number 3 is well, and so on and so forth. The issue that arises from this is that deaf students have to look up at the interpreter, see the answer to number 1, look down at their paper, and correct or record the answer or mark themselves correct, and then look back up for number 2. And by that time, the teacher could be on 3 or 4, and that sort of delay just increases as you go. And it's called the split eye phenomenon in the interpreting world. And it's an issue with not only things like that, but whenever you're giving verbal instruction, it's always important that the instruction is also presented visually. And it's another one of those things that benefits deaf students, but will benefit all of the visual learners in our classroom, and not just the hard of hearing or deaf students. For going back to the multiplication page example, an accommodation could be putting the answers up on your projector, your Elmo projector, or your smart board if the key is visual. Or you could write them on your chalkboard or write them on your whiteboard, and it certainly does take a little longer, but you'll save time. You'll save frustration on a lot of students' part because even the hearing students will get behind from time to time or miss them. But you're also going to save time on the back end because often what happens in those things at the end, you'll have several students raise their hand and ask, what was the answer to number 4, or hey, I didn't get 16, or Mr. or Miss, I missed question 12 or whatever. And so this will save you time on the back end, because you'll have those all there for them to check themselves and to go back if they need to. The other thing that can help us in the classroom is incorporating some hand signals into everyday communication. And a basic example of this would be for getting water, going to the bathroom. Oftentimes a hearing student might raise their hand, and when called on, they'll say, "Can I go to the bathroom?" or "Can I go to the restroom?" Or "Can I get a drink of water?" For deaf students, they have to involve the interpreter in that. And anytime you can encourage direct communication with any of your students, you build that one-on-one connection, and um, I think it's a way of showing students that you really care about them individually. And so, for the bathroom or water, you might have a hand signal like holding up a 1 means water and holding up 2 means bathroom, and that's something that you can use with all the students. It isn't sign language for bathroom or sign language for water, but it's a way of communicating that allows you to connect directly with a deaf student, and it's something that all the students can use. And this again takes some of the frustration off. It takes some of what they might be feeling off, in regards to the communication barrier that is obviously present between you and the sign language user. So sound fields and FM systems. Now these are some cool developments in hearing technology, but certainly something that I hope that classrooms incorporate. So first I'll talk about the sound field, and I'm going to go back a couple of slides real quick so I can show an example of that. That's not really showing a great example of that. Well, we'll use this anyway. So this classroom, this picture, and it's hard to see because of the title, so I'm sorry about that, but this classroom is set up with a sound field. And basically what a sound field is just a box that kind of sits off on a wall, and it's a transmitter that's connected to a microphone that typically sits around the teacher's neck, and it looks like maybe a half crescent shape, some of them are box shaped, but pretty lightweight. They hang around the teacher's neck. They can be muted. The range is not too great, but it certainly will suffice in most classroom sizes. And what this does is anything that is set into the mic is transmitted to surround sound speakers that are basically installed in the classroom. And this is another accommodation that also benefits your hearing students, because I know certainly from my own experience in classrooms, I've dozed off during lectures, or maybe I've seen something shiny on the wall and been distracted. And so using just a speaker system, an amplification system, helps maintain focus for students, and it also helps the deaf and hard of hearing students, because as we all know, an increase in distance decreases the strength of sound, and makes it more difficult for hard of hearing students and deaf students to pick up on what's being said. This allows the signal to have a standard strength, or allows the signal to stay strong or the sound wave to stay strong no matter where the student's sitting, because maybe they can't hear you, but they can hear the speaker. And this is a device that can be passed around to students, so if students are doing presentations or things like that, this certainly helps. The other one was the FM system, and the way this one works, this is very similar. It's also a sound amplification system, but this one works specifically with your hard of hearing students, and so this doesn't directly benefit your hearing students, but it certainly indirectly benefits them in the sense that it eases communication between non-sign language users and sign language users, or hard of hearing students. I shouldn't say sign language users, but so anyway, the way the FM system works is it's basically a lot like a microphone, and so it again has a microphone component. So typically it sits on your ear and it comes right in front of your mouth. Some are clipped on. Can be clipped onto your shirt or your collar or whatever, and it goes to a little box that can typically sit on your belt or again in a pocket or something, and it transmits a signal directly to the hard of hearing student's hearing aid, and uh, this this is great for students with moderate hearing loss, and this just again allows them to focus and allows them to have a clear idea of what you're saying. Um, if you're moving around the room, again, depending on where they're seated, it can be difficult for them to hear you. But with an FM system, that can sort of ease that. Okay, so the next accommodation I want to talk about is definitely one we as teachers have a lot more control in terms of implementing, and because sound field isn't always available in classrooms, and even FM systems are not always available to districts. But oral presentations are certainly available, and so one way to accommodate this is instead of having a written essay, have them present their essay in sign language. And that's one way of doing it, but another way that I've seen implemented that I think works a little better and still maintains the goal of them writing their assignment and working on their writing, because that certainly is a goal, especially with Common Core in all classrooms. They want math and social studies and science to really have a strong writing component, and so what this would do is you would record your deaf student signing their story in sign language, and then they would be able to look back at that video recording as a reference for when they're typing, because English is their second language. Thinking in English while you're writing can be very difficult, whereas thinking in sign language and producing sign language comes much more naturally for them. That way they can watch piece by piece what they're signing and then begin to type that out. This also helps them work on some of their cognitive skills and developing their language, because a lot of times their grasp of sign language in English is not strong enough for them to interpret or translate on a context level. They think very much on the word level, and so they think this one sign means this one word, when we as native English users know that there are very few words that don't have synonyms, and so a lot of times students, hard of hearing students, deaf students, ability to translate their own work suffers, because they're not thinking on the context level, they're not thinking on the sentence level, the paragraph level, and so this helps them do that. This helps them really effectively explain their thinking, and I think helps develop a concrete understanding of the content or whatever is being presented. Sign writing. So this is another way to develop a student's vocabulary in English using sign language. So sign writing is a very new thing in the deaf community. It's only been around a handful of years, and it really is a pretty neat thing. And I'm still very, very new at it. I don't understand a lot of it. But it's just a way of visually representing the hands and facial grammar. And it's read from top to bottom. So you would start here and then read your way down, and then come up here and read your way down. And so if students can learn this, they can write out what they're saying as opposed to recording themselves, and then look at what they've said in sign language and start working on translating their own work, and that hopefully will develop their English skills. The other thing is, when they're learning English vocabulary, they can use this as a note-taking system. If they know what the sign is, they can help them remember what the word is, and so if they come across a word and they don't remember what it means, they can look back at their sign writing vocabulary book or whatever you have them make, and look up what the sign is for that word, and that hopefully will help them develop vocabulary not only in English but in sign language as well. The last one I wanted to talk about is not necessarily an accommodation only for deaf and hard of hearing students. This is an accommodation used for students with all kinds of different disabilities, and that's preferential seating, and that just pretty much means that the students the student will have their choice of seating, or wherever the seating will best accommodate their needs. And a lot of people think that this is in the front, and certainly for some kids it is. But for deaf kids, there's a couple of interesting things to consider. Um, we want to make sure that they're in a place where they can access everything visually, and I think immediately we think of the board, the teacher, and those are certainly good places to look for visual information without a doubt. But one of the other things to consider when setting up a seating assignment for deaf and hard of hearing students is their visual access to their peers, their classmates. Because, for example, if a student's sitting in the front of the room and um, Bobby Joe in the back row yells out something or does something funny and the rest of the class laughs, by the time that's interpreted and the student then has to turn around and look to try to figure out who was doing what, they may have missed what had happened. And I'll go ahead and give it an example of the classroom here. So the front obviously here is a great place for access to the board and the teacher. But even somewhere like along the side, maybe in the back here or in the middle towards the back, would be not a terrible place for the deaf students. The primary things you want to remember is that they can see the interpreter and they have access to the board. But the further back you can seat them and still provide that access, the better. You don't want to sit them too far back because they still need to be able to see the interpreter clearly. But if they can see their peers, they can readily identify who's talking. If something happens, they can see what's happening, and I think it allows them to sort of to interact with their classmates. I think if you have all the kids with preferential seating forced to sit in the front, I think you unintentionally segregate your class. When I think there are ways we can still provide preferential seating without going to the standard front of the classroom idea. So that's just something to think about. That's pretty much it for my presentation. I've learned a lot, and I could have gone on and on about the accommodations that benefit both the deaf and hard of hearing population and the mainstream population, and that's what I found most interesting about doing this research. And I imagine that it stands true for a lot of other multicultural ideas or ways to integrate or to promote a healthy classroom, is that a lot of these accommodations or a lot of these activities or modifications really benefit your entire classroom and not just the students that we're serving. So I think that's something that I think is worth definitely emphasizing, is how can we provide accommodations that not only meet the needs of the students that need them, but also enhance the experience and the education for all the students in the classroom. So thank you for your time, guys. If you have any questions, of course, you can fill them out in the forum or something like that. I'll go ahead and attach the PowerPoint without my lovely face on it, although I don't know why you'd want that. And the bibliography that has the different things that I looked at and read. And yeah, I think that's it, guys. Take care.